Welcome back to the PolicyViz podcast. I'm your host, John Schwabish. On this week's episode of the show, I'm very happy to have author Karla Starr, co-author with Chip Heath of the new book, Making Numbers Count. This is a topic that's sort of near and dear to my heart because, especially for working in the federal government for a long time, how do we effectively communicate large numbers? Do you have any idea what $27.5 trillion means? Do you have any idea, even if I compared that to stacking Empire State Buildings on top of each other, that they would go from here to the moon and back? I don't know if those comparisons are correct, by the way, but are those even relatable? Does that even help you? I don't think so. And Karla and Chip have written this great book. It's a really nice, short, easy read. I really highly recommend it, about making these better comparisons and how we can all do so. And we talk in the interview about doing this kind of verbally or within our writing, but we also talk a little bit about how we can apply it to our data visualizations, which is not a focal point of the book, but of course for listeners of this show is particularly important. So I'm going to head off and let you listen to this interview with Karla Starr, co-author of the new book, Making Numbers Count. I hope you'll enjoy it. Hi, Karla. Welcome to the show. Great to see you.
Hey, thanks so much for having me, John. Great to be here.
I'm very excited to chat with you. New book, Making Numbers Count. You and Chip Heath, you got your name right there. Oh, look at that, right on the bottom.
Right
we'll both hold up our copies of the book. Right on the bottom, it's got a nice big ruler on it. Yeah, I love it.
Yeah.
I mean, I think you have hit on a huge challenge. I don't know if it's a problem, but a huge challenge in the data.
What's the problem? It's both.
Yeah, it's both.
Yeah.
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 So maybe you can give folks like the quick, synopsis but more like what I'm interested in, for folks who haven't talked or heard about it or read it, you can maybe give a quick synopsis. But what I'm interested in is like, why did you come to this? Why was this the book that you wanted to write? What was the motivating factor behind it?
Well, Chip and I had been discussing books to write together for a while, and we've gone through a bunch of different topics. And then he told me that for his class, because teaching at Stanford made this stick, they were talking about, the importance of not using numbers for a while. And then during, some year when he was teaching it, some person who was in his role in his class was also he was in finance, and he said, I can't not use numbers. Numbers are my world. So he started developing this little module, this little class on how they could use numbers within the Made to Stick framework. And so that was the inspiration, or like the basis for the idea. And so when I started doing research, I started, doing all this like really fascinating research about numbers and communication. And we hit upon the idea that numbers are a foreign language, right? So everybody's second language at best. And I think a lot of times people might think that they're bad at math, or they're bad at numbers, and they're just not a numbers person, but really no one is a numbers person. Our brain was designed, or our brain, evolved to deal with physical, concrete things that are right in front of our face, not with the abstract, like, 5%, or 1 trillion. So because of that, we really, you can't talk about numbers in a way that people understand them, but you need to really understand just how to translate them. And that's why I wrote the book.
Yeah. So can you give me an example, like just a quick example to sort of set the stage for folks? Like give me an example of making that, $1 trillion or, five, whatever the debt is now, trillions and trillions of dollars, making it more understandable and relatable.
Yeah. So the example in the book is, the U.S. national debt is $27 trillion. I think now it's higher.
Yeah. Right.
But
pre-COVID versus post-COVID, right? Yeah.
Oh man, I know. Well, that's the thing. This book was like out of date the second it was printed.
Right. Yeah. Of course. Yeah.
Yeah. So $27 trillion per person. That's $82,000. So if you just think about every single person you see, $82,000. That's a lot of money, obviously.
Right.
So that's one of the examples that we use in the book, where it's just, our brains cannot process $27 trillion. So I do want to say that I think my favorite example in the book is one that I actually remember from TV from when I was a kid. It was on Earth Day.
Mm-hmm.
At some point, I was watching some, special online. Not online. There was no internet
No
when I was that
online.
young. There was no online.
No
I'm that
online.
old.
Yeah. Some people are listening to this like, what do you mean there's no online? Yeah, there's no online.
Where did you use the internet? So the statistic was, 97.5% of the Earth's water is salinated, and of the 2.5% that is freshwater, most of it is dirty or trapped in glaciers or underground.
Right.
Meaning that only 0.01% of that is available for human consumption. So our translation for that, and this is what was shown on TV on Earth Day when I was a kid that I still remember very clearly.
Wow.
There's this woman holding this gallon jug of water, and she said, if you took all the Earth's water and put it into this gallon jug, humans would only be able to drink that last drop.
Wow. Yeah.
That's
So
cool.
Yeah, I mean, and the fact that it's stuck in your head, right? Like, I mean, that's kind of the whole point, right? But do you to the debt one, because the debt one, having spent a lot of time in government, like the debt one strikes me as very a challenge I always had. Is there boiling it down to like per person, do we lose the sense of the magnitude? Does the magnitude, like, is it just so big that it doesn't really matter in the first place? It's like kind of looking at the Grand Canyon and you're like, I can't fathom that, so it doesn't really matter.
Right. It's like you're looking, last night I was like looking at the stars. It was just a beautiful clear night, and I was like, that is very far away.
Right.
That like,
Right.
It's just like okay, yeah,
Yeah.
like 1, 2, 3 trillion. I think you do something, and I actually, one of the things that I wanted to put in the book was a little example of the U.S. Our budget, or at least the debt, but put it into smaller terms. We have this framework at the end about making scale models of things that I really, really like. And I think that really seems to resonate with people. You take the same numbers, but you just chop off a few zeros.
Yeah.
And then you can talk about it maybe in terms of a family's income and their expenditures, right? A family's budget.
Right.
And then you would get the sense of, oh, this is how much we are spending, per person. This is how unsustainable our spending practices are. We're spending. So we actually were kind of working with a little example about that, saying, okay, so if the U.S. government was a family, they would spend half of their income on a security system.
Yeah. Right.
So
then what about this connection or trade-off between accuracy and I think we would both sort of agree, like the more effective communication. Like if something is $1.85 trillion, sometimes that 0.85 is really important. If we said it's about 2, or if it's $80,000 per person or whatever it is, we sort of lose that accuracy. So how do you think about that trade-off?
Right. So there's this principle in the book called user-friendly numbers. That would be, saying $2 trillion would stick with people and resonate with people, and people will be able to just understand that a lot better than 1.85 trillion. So you think about your brain is having to store like 1 unit of information versus 3 units of information. I think really this comes down to know your audience so much, because I do find that people a lot of times when they're talking within their industry or within their discipline, I've been talking with a lot of financial advisors lately, and they're so used to using, compound interest and interest rates and like all of these different things. And so they can talk to each other about it just fine. The problem is when they try to talk to a client or a potential client, and then they forget about the fact that, for the client, user-friendly has a much different definition than to a colleague.
Yeah.
And their framework was much different. So I do think a lot of this does depend on, know your audience and what would be friendly to that particular user.
Yeah.
And then also, I think to your point about, sometimes, if you're in the government, you have to use 1.85 trillion instead of 2 trillion.
Right.
I guess I would push back with why. Why is it so important? Is it because everybody in the audience would know that you're rounding, and then they would begin to doubt the veracity or the truthfulness of your data? Or do they think that you're trying to advance some sort of agenda, by rounding,
right,
or something?
Yeah. No, I think that's right. And like you said, it depends on who you're trying to communicate with, your audience. So which the financial advisor example is really interesting. So when you talk to folks in, say, the financial industry, and you talk about these comparisons, and you talk about because you mentioned like the other words like compound interest, I wonder, as people you're talking to and working with, you get them to start thinking about phrasing numbers in a different way. Do they also start thinking about just the other words that they used? Like, for example, I can imagine someone saying 1.25% compound interest, blah, 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 blah. And both of those things might be really difficult for a non-specialist to like understand. So do you find as people start to, make the numbers more relatable, they also start thinking about just the other words that they use and how they communicate?
I do think that using other words sort of naturally follows if you think about the numbers a little differently.
Mm-hmm.
So, for example, with the financial planners, I used the example recently. I was considering having the floors redone in my home.
Mm-hmm.
They're kind of scratched up. And so, I had some people come in and give estimates, and it was like $8,000. So I was thinking $8,000. Okay, from this financial planner standpoint, I would say, okay, so what would that look like? That would look like if and I put it aside and I, put it somewhere, that would be, in a few decades or, however many years, it would be like $20,000,
Right.
or to put another way, there's a savings goal that I have. I would be able to reach my savings goal like maybe 8 months faster, right?
Mm-hmm.
If I didn't have my hardwood floors done. So then now I'm thinking about time, right?
Mm.
So now like that's my unit of currency. So now I'm thinking about my hardwood floors, and that's 8 months away, and it has nothing to do with compound interest. However, if
Yeah.
you take the $8,000 and you put it in a bank account, compound interest, blah blah blah. So you don't really even have to talk about that, all the specific things, because now I'm just talking about time, and I'm just talking about like, how much work I would have to do
Right.
in order to like save for the floors, or when I would be
Yeah.
losing, like what the trade-offs would be for the floors.
Right. Yeah, so it's just sort of recouching or restating or it's really reframing it.
Exactly. You're reframing it in a common vocabulary,
Mm-hmm.
so that you don't even really have to talk about like all the nitty gritty specifics about compound interest. I find
Mm-hmm.
too that it's one of those things where people, I think we're all slightly scarred from some math class or some math lesson. But to a certain extent, whether or not we want to admit it. So I think sometimes when you just say the word interest, people are like, oh,
Yeah.
but if you talk about it in terms of like um, time or a trade-off or any other kind of a unit of measurement that just it feels more natural or something, or more used to dealing with, or say like, oh, you could get the hardwood floors, or you wouldn't be able to go on vacation for how many years.
Right.
Now we're talking about currency that is very important and near and dear to my mental health. Right.
Right. But yeah, right. So it's interesting because like but then there's that added piece. I mean, I guess it's separate from the numbers, but the added piece of, I'm just looking at my scratched up floors. The utility of having those floors look better for the next X number of years. Like I can't retire. I have to retire 8 months later, but I have the floors looking nicer for at least part of that time until someone scratches it. Right. Um,
Exactly.
yeah.
Yeah. So there's always a trade-off. So there was one example, again, we didn't put in the book, and then so when I moved here a year and a half ago from New York, so, my furniture, I now live in Portland, Oregon. I actually have a little bit of living space, which I did not have before. So I got new furniture, and I was thinking like all of these things, right? But the trade-offs, like, should I buy like the nice couch,
Yeah.
or should I buy just like the crappy couch? And I was like, you know what? I went with, I think that some of these things really you can't quantify exactly, right? Because
Yeah.
what is the trade off, right? If I bought the crappy couch, okay, so maybe I would reach my savings goal a little bit, sooner. However, I wouldn't really like my living room as
Right.
much. I wouldn't be as comfortable for the next few decades. And
Right.
that's pretty important to me. Like, how can you put a price tag on that?
Yeah, no, that's right. That's right. How much, it's consumption, investment, and all these things are they're often mixed together. But I think to the core point of the book, it's about communicating those numbers. And there's not a lot about the data visualization part in the book, which is, what a lot of listeners of this podcast are primarily interested in. But I would suspect that if you if I were, and I'm not going to, but if I were to give you $1 million to write the Make Numbers Count visual book, the follow up.
You can do it, John. I believe you.
Well, so much for those new floors. Let me tell you. But if you were to write the DataViz version of this book, I would assume that the lessons would be basically the same, right? That when you make the bar chart of national debt, you still turn it into per capita numbers, or you stretch it out over time and still make those comparisons, right?
Yeah, 100%. I think one of the basic like lessons in here, like this is a book about communication,
Mm-hmm.
and what are they always tell writers? They always tell writers, show, don't tell.
Mm-hmm.
So I think if there was one takeaway from this book, it would be show, don't tell. It was turn your numbers into something that is concrete, something that's tangible, something that we don't have to think about, something that we just immediately grok. And I think it's the same thing with visualization.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. Make it as obvious as possible.
Yeah. There is a really interesting part, and it's kind of there's a really interesting part kind of halfway through the book, where you talk about a comparison where you're comparing the population of one city to multiple cities, and in that section you talk about large cities in China, which probably most people in the United States, including myself, like I'm looking at my little notes here because I don't know those cities, but the large cities compared to cities in China. And so I guess the question is, how do you think and how do you talk about knowing your audience in their society, their culture, their community, their country is for this whole discussion?
Right. So I like to think of it in terms of I call it the MacGyver principle. Right. So what did MacGyver do whenever he was trying to solve something? He would just look around him and he would just use whatever tools were available to him. I think when you're trying to figure out what would resonate well with your audience, it's the same principle, right? You're using whatever geographical references would resonate with them. You're using, so there's a section in here about the social distancing measures and how different places around the world reference those. So I think, in California, some of the public health announcements were, one surfboard. In France, it was like, stay 2 baguettes away.
Yeah, I don't know what to handle about that one, but okay, yeah, I got the point. Yeah.
Yeah. So I think if you're right, so you could use whatever cities that your audience would be familiar with. And I think that if you start talking about something that's foreign, it's like, I don't know, I have no idea how big those cities are in China.
Right.
I know that China is big, kind of like the Grand Canyon, or it's just very big. And I do remember hearing those statistics about like how many cities in China, have more than 1 million people. And I was like, that's a lot.
Right.
That's really all I know. And I feel like an idiot because I know Beijing, I know Shanghai.
That's it.
I know nothing about China.
Right. No, it's really, it's just an interesting kind of cultural observation that, we sort of know our own experience. And you've already talked about it in lots of different ways, but like our own experience includes where we've grown up and where we're currently living and, those comparisons. And they don't necessarily translate globally. I would guess the same is true for units of measurement. Meter versus yard. Of course, we're like the only ones who do that, but
right. Which again is my point. I think meter versus yard, or when I wrote the book with Chip, I was in New York and he was in the Bay Area. So we would also talk about height. So we tried to think of, okay, if you had to explain how tall Mount Everest is, that would be like, if a person was a grain of rice and, it was a 3-story building or a 1-story building, or if a person was, I think, as tall as a paperclip, then it would be a 3-story building. And I was thinking like, oh, that makes sense to me because I'm in New York. There's plenty, right? For him, he was in the suburbs. He was like 1-story building, So then we were going back and forth about, well, this makes sense to these people. This doesn't make, sense to these people. So even just that might be something that is much more intuitive to an audience. And I think that is, again, one of the reasons why time works so well, because time is universal. I think even $1,000 would mean something completely different, from say, a neurosurgeon, in a major city to like say, a a single mother with kids in
Right.
Oklahoma. $1,000 is something completely different, but 5 minutes is about 5 minutes.
Right. Right. It's also the comparison that I think a lot of us have seen a lot that I never found useful is like, oh, if you put I don't know, the dollars in the debt, the physical dollars, like laid them out, it would go from, here to the moon and back. And I'm always like, well,
Reagan.
yeah.
Exactly. But how many times do you say, "Oh my gosh, honey, I'm so sorry. I did this, but when I was out buying groceries, there happened to be a sale, at like the sporting goods store next door. So I went in and I spent like 2 inches worth of dollar bills."
Right. Right. Like, what? Yeah.
No one ever uses that.
Yeah. I
So I
mean,
think that's an example of something that happens all the time though in government and
yeah.
policy is people try to wow us with, "Oh, this seems really big," right?
Hmm.
Or, "Oh, it's 3 Empire State Buildings tall," or, "Oh, if
Yeah.
you took the size of our debt and you turned it into pennies,
Right.
those pennies would
Yeah.
weigh as much as like half of the moon or something."
Right.
And I'm like, I have no idea what any of those numbers mean.
Yeah.
Right? I think it's called wowism. It's like we're really just trying to like wow people with quantity,
Hmm.
but we have absolutely no idea what that means. It's just
Right.
completely abstract. And I think people actually get away with using those kind of crappy examples because a lot of people have this narrative that they're playing in. I'm not a numbers person. I'm not a numbers person. I don't know what this means. So therefore, that must be impressive. And I don't want to say anything because I don't want to sound like an idiot.
Right.
Really, the impetus should be on the person who's doing the communicating and who's, to make that not just wow, but wow, and I understand that.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, yeah, it's putting all these into, it seems like the underlying theme is putting everything in personal terms for your audience.
Yeah,
Obviously,
personal
like,
terms
yeah. Yeah. Depending on who that audience is, right?
Or just kind of looking at like what their typical frames of reference are. Exactly. What kind of measurements we use on a daily basis, or what kinds of items we use on a daily basis, which I think is like why counterintuitively making things small and boring actually makes them really fascinating. So if you take, I think there's a story in here about, like Kenyans, or like how much money they have to spend on their. Okay, so make things personal. So to that, right, I think making things small and boring can actually make them very impressive, counterintuitively. So say if you want to talk about like how small a percentage of something was, you could say, hey, this pen, if say this entire pen was our budget, the amount that I'm spending is only one line.
Right.
And if you right, so that we could say that as a percentage of like, we have this example in here of like the national endowment for the art, and it's arts, and if you try to balance the budget by taking away the NEA funding, say it's $160 million, like that actually sounds like a lot, but in terms of percentages, it's not. So if you try to balance the budget by removing NEA funding, it's the equivalent of trying to edit, I think, a 60,000 word novel by removing 4 words.
Right. So
Right.
it's
Or
interesting.
like trying to save it. Yeah.
No, I was going to say, it's kind of like, in some ways, that approach is almost the opposite of wowism, right? Like, I like this term wowism, right? Like, it's kind of the opposite of that. It's saying, okay, if a human was the size, to what you sort of were playing around with earlier, if a human was the size of a paperclip, then this building would be the size of blah, blah, blah. And same thing here, right? It's if you were editing a book, everybody sort of can think of a novel. It's about, editing 4 words. So it's like, it seems like it's just boiling everything down into something. It's the opposite of wowism, which I don't know what that word would be, but yeah.
Human scale,
but it doesn't have the same ring as wowism. Yeah.
I know. Right.
Smallism. I don't know what it is.
Right. Or doesm.
Doesm, yeah.
Yeah. No, exactly. So I think that it is very counterintuitive, but you actually get more of this, oh, wow, reaction when you shrink them down because, again, our brains evolved to deal with concrete things that are right in front of our face. Like probably the first sentence ever said was, oh shit, there's a fire.
Right.
Right.
Right. There it is.
Right.
Yeah.
Like we have to do something about this right now. Not, oh, in that field over there, there are 5.5 things, like we just don't we have to think about those. Like, we don't get that immediate, emotional, tangible reaction that we want.
Right.
So I think it is, people constantly try to just add all these zeros to the numbers, or not even thinking about taking them away, because but the thing is, once you reach this certain threshold, it's just, you're not going to get that reaction. You're not going to have people understand the ratio that you want to talk about.
Yeah. Well, very good. This is it's a really fun book. I'll also say, like, it was a really nice, easy read. You guys are good writers, so that's another reason for people to pick it up. Like, just get to it. I wanted to just ask one more question on where people can find you and where they could learn more about, because I'm guessing there are lots of people who are like, well, I don't work in the federal budget, but I work in my company and we are serving tens of thousands of people with our product or service, but we have the same fundamental problem.
Yeah. So you can find me online. Is that what you mean?
That now exists, right?
Right. Yes, the internet now exists. Right. So you can find me in my office in Portland, Oregon, next to my dog. More accurately, you can find me online, kstarr.com.
Awesome. That's great.
Yeah. It's been a lot of fun talking to different readers and helping people figure out how to use these techniques in their own lives and their work. Been doing also working with people, helping them with presentations, which has actually been really fun, because I think it's so clear, it's so sharp. I did something, sorry, a tangent, but I was helping somebody understand. They were trying to figure out how to teach the importance of budgeting to teenagers.
Sure.
Because budgeting is not cool. And so we did something, I figured it's kind of the opposite of the scale model, actually. It was celebrity bankruptcies. So, because I think people don't like the idea of budgeting, because they think in terms of like small, like, oh, I have to like take this money out. They think it's for poor people. But if you actually round up and you look at, no, celebrities can go bankrupt too.
Yeah.
Nick Cage, I think he's making, like, he made $40 million in 1 year.
Right.
And now he has nothing. And it's because he just had this like horrible spending addiction.
Yeah. Huh. So it's framing it the other way. So that is a little bit of wowism, but again, to the audience, right? To teenagers who can, or at least sort of tap into that, right? Yeah.
Exactly. Right. Like, so they can see the importance of it. It's not just for, for people who have no money. It's really something that's important for everybody.
Right. All right. Well, on that note of teaching kids how to be better with their money, Karla, thanks so much for coming on the show. It's been great chatting with you. Thanks for the book. Appreciate it.
Yeah. Thank you so much for having me, John. It's been great.
Thanks everyone for tuning into this week's episode of the show. I hope you enjoyed that. I'm going to put links to the book and Karla's website and a couple other resources in the episode notes section of the webpage. So please do check that out. Also, check out all the new opportunities where you can support the podcast. I have my existing Patreon page. I've also started a new paid version of the newsletter. I have the free version. If you just want that, that's great. The paid version will give you some behind the scenes insights, some sneak peeks at new YouTube videos, and an opportunity to meet with me every once in a while in person to ask questions and have conversation and just chill out for a little bit. And I've also got the Winnow app that I've started up, where I'm shooting out some short little data viz things that I observe via text message, if you'd rather get text rather than emails. So check all those out. They're all listed in the episode notes page of this podcast episode. I hope you enjoyed that interview. I hope you will think carefully about how you communicate your next set of numbers. So until next time, this has been the PolicyViz podcast. Thanks so much for listening.